If you were alive in 1975, you probably remember the exact moment the shark came out of the water. Not because you were at the beach, but because you were sitting in a movie theater that summer, gripping the armrest of a seat that cost you $2.50. That was the year. The year the movie line wrapped around the block, the gas station still had odd even signs in the window, and the President of the United States tripped on the stairs of Air Force One on live television. Number 97 on this list changed how Americans spent their Saturday nights forever. Number 19 was a machine that promised to replace the family photo album, and for a while it did. So hit subscribe and settle in, because here are 100 things that made 1975 one of the most unforgettable years in American life. Number 100. The Sears Roebuck Catalog, the thick one. The fall edition arrived in the mailbox sometime in August or September, and it weighed more than some of the children who carried it inside. In 1975, the Sears catalog was still the way most American families did their serious shopping. It was not a luxury, it was infrastructure. You sat at the kitchen table, turned the thin paper pages, circled what you wanted with a ballpoint pen, and then you either mailed in the order form or drove to the Sears catalog desk at the store and handed it to the woman behind the counter. The clothes came in a brown box a few weeks later. If they did not fit, you mailed them back. There was no tracking number. There was no confirmation email. You just waited. For millions of families outside major cities, the Sears catalog was the closest thing to a department store they had. Number 99. Jaws. Steven Spielberg was 28 years old when Jaws opened on June 20th, 1975, in 409 theaters across the country. That number matters. Before Jaws, a major motion picture opened in a handful of theaters in New York and Los Angeles, then slowly rolled out across the country over months. Jaws changed that. Universal Pictures put it everywhere at once, backed it with a national television advertising campaign, and watched the lines form on opening weekend. By the end of the summer, it had earned over $260 million and become the highest-grossing film in history. It also emptied the beaches. Coastal towns from New Jersey to Florida reported measurable drops in swimming that summer. People knew the shark was not real. They had read the Peter Benchley novel. They understood it was a rubber prop on a mechanical arm. None of that mattered. Nobody wanted to be the one who said the water was fine. Number 98. The Fall of Saigon. On April 30th, 1975, a helicopter lifted off from the roof of the American embassy in Saigon, and the longest war in American history was over. The television footage showed desperate crowds pressing against the embassy gates, people climbing fences, families separated on the tarmac. In living rooms across the United States, the images landed without commentary. There was no celebration. There was no parade. The soldiers who had already come home had come home quietly, often to indifference or worse. And now the final chapter played out on the evening news between a cereal commercial and the weather report. For the families who had lost someone in Vietnam, April 30th was not a political event. It was the day the last door closed. For everyone else, it was the strange, unsettling moment when America lost something it had never lost before, and nobody was entirely sure what to call it. Number 97. Saturday Night Live. On October 11, 1975, a comedian named George Carlin stood on a bare stage inside Studio 8H at 30 Rockefeller Plaza and opened a show that nobody expected to last past Christmas. NBC had given producer Lorne Michaels a late-night slot that most executives considered worthless. The show aired live at 11:30 on Saturday night. The cast was unknown. The humor was raw, political, and occasionally incomprehensible to anyone over 40. The first sketch audiences remember is the one with John Belushi and the samurai sword, though it did not actually air in the premiere. What did air that first night was Carlin, Andy Kaufman lip-syncing the Mighty Mouse theme, and a loose energy that felt nothing like the polished variety shows that still dominated prime time. It should not have worked. The ratings were modest, The reviews were mixed, but the audience it found never let go of it. Number 96. The AMC Pacer. American Motors introduced the Pacer in 1975 as the first wide, small car. That was the actual marketing phrase. It had more glass than any production vehicle on the road, a wraparound rear window that made it look like a fishbowl on wheels, and a passenger side door that was 4 inches longer than the driver's side door so the rear passengers could get in and out more easily. It weighed 3,200 pounds, which was not small at all, and it got roughly 20 miles to the gallon, which was not impressive either. The Pacer was AMC's attempt to build an efficient car that did not feel like a sacrifice. The public's response was complicated. People either loved it or found it ridiculous. There was very little middle ground with the Pacer. There never was. Number 95. Bruce Springsteen on the covers of Time and Newsweek. In the same week in October 1975, Bruce Springsteen appeared on the cover of both Time and Newsweek simultaneously. No rock musician had ever done that. The album was Born to Run, and the hype machine behind it was enormous, but the music was real. The title track opened with a motorcycle revving and a saxophone line that sounded like it had been recorded inside a thunderstorm. Springsteen was 26, rail thin, and playing 3-hour concerts in clubs that held 800 people. Columbia Records had bet everything on this album after 2 earlier records that sold modestly, and the dual cover moment was supposed to make him a star overnight. Did, and it did not. The fame came, but Springsteen spent the next 3 years in a legal dispute with his former manager and did not release another album until 1978. The covers made him famous. The music made him last. Number 94. The 55-mile-per-hour national speed limit. In January 1974, President Nixon signed the Emergency Highway Energy Conservation Act, which set the maximum speed limit on every highway in America at 55 miles per hour. By 1975, every state had complied, and the change was deeply felt. Interstates that had been designed for 70 were now policed at 55. Long-haul truckers hated it. Commuters in western states, where the next town was 90 miles away, called it absurd. Bumper stickers that read 55 is a crawl appeared on pickup trucks across the country. The law was tied to the oil crisis, and the government argued it saved fuel and saved lives. Both claims were true. Neither made the speed limit popular. For the next 2 decades, 55 became the most widely ignored law in America, and the radar detector became one of its best-selling consumer products. Number 93. Welcome Back, Kotter. The show premiered on ABC in September 1975, and within a month, every kid in America was saying "up your nose" with a rubber hose. Gabe Kaplan played Gabe Kotter, a high school teacher in Brooklyn who returned to his alma mater to teach a remedial class full of lovable delinquents called the Sweat Hogs. The real star was a 21-year-old actor from New Jersey named John Travolta who played Vinnie Barbarino with a grin and a swagger that made him the biggest teen idol in the country before the first season was over. The show ran for 4 seasons. Travolta left after 3 to make movies. The rest of the cast had more complicated careers. But in 1975, Welcome Back, Kotter was the show that proved a sitcom about a bad classroom could be the funniest thing on television. Number 92. The Hustle. Van McCoy released The Hustle in the spring of 1975, and by summer, every wedding reception, roller rink, and company Christmas party in America had a line of adults attempting the steps. The song was simple, a pulsing disco beat, a string section doing most of the melodic work, and Van McCoy's voice whispering "Do the hustle" at intervals. The dance itself had about 6 moves, depending on which version you learned. The basic line dance was manageable. The partner version was more ambitious. Either way, the hustle was the moment disco stopped being a New York City phenomenon and landed in the suburbs. Your parents learned it from the couple next door. Your aunt taught it to your grandmother. By 1976, Van McCoy had earned a Grammy for it. the song never entirely went away. Number 91. Hamburger Helper. General Mills had introduced it in 1971, but by 1975, Hamburger Helper was not a convenience product anymore. It was a survival strategy. Inflation had pushed grocery prices up sharply. Beef was expensive. A pound of ground beef cost around 89 cents, and Hamburger Helper let a family stretch that pound into a full dinner for 5. You browned the meat, added the noodles from the box, stirred in the seasoning packet, added water, and you had what the box promised, a meal. The mascot was a left-hand glove with a face, and it appeared on every box, every commercial, and eventually in the anxious dreams of children who stared at it too long under fluorescent grocery store light. Hamburger Helper was not aspirational cooking. It was math. 1 pound, 1 box, 5 plates. That was the formula that sold millions. Number 90. Gerald Ford and the Stumble. On a visit to Salzburg, Austria in June 1975, President Gerald Ford walked down the rain-slickened stairs of Air Force One, lost his footing, and tumbled to the bottom in front of the assembled press corps and a live television audience. He was not hurt. He stood up, straightened his tie, and continued walking. It did not matter. The fall was replayed on every evening newscast, made every newspaper front page, and became the defining image of a presidency that already struggled with the perception that Ford was clumsy. Chevy Chase built an entire career around the impression on the first season of Saturday Night Live that fall. Ford had actually been one of the most athletic presidents in history, a standout football player at the University of Michigan. None of that mattered once the tape existed. The fall became the presidency. Number 89. The Catalytic Converter. Starting with the 1975 model year, every new car sold in America was required to have a catalytic converter bolted to its exhaust system. The device used platinum and palladium to convert carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons into less harmful gases before they left the tailpipe. For the engineers, it was an emissions breakthrough. For the car-buying public, it was an unwelcome addition under the floor. The converter required unleaded gasoline, which meant every car built before 1975 could no longer share a pump nozzle with the new models. Gas stations installed new pumps with smaller nozzle openings to prevent mix-ups. Performance dropped. Horsepower ratings fell across every manufacturer's lineup. Mechanics complained that the converters ran too hot and created a sulfur smell. Drivers missed the raw exhaust note of the old engines. The catalytic converter cleaned the air and irritated everyone doing it. That was 1975. Number 88. The Waterbed. By 1975, the waterbed had migrated from its countercultural origins into the bedrooms of middle-class suburbia. Sales were climbing sharply toward what would become a billion-dollar industry by the early 1980s. They came in king-size frames made of stained pine or dark walnut, and filling one required a garden hose threaded through the bedroom window and 20 minutes of patience. The mattress itself was a vinyl bladder that weighed close to 2,000 pounds when full, which meant that apartments on upper floors sometimes refused them, and bedroom floors occasionally sagged beneath them. Sleeping on a waterbed for the first time was a specific experience. Every shift in weight sent a slow wave across the surface. Getting out required a rolling technique that no one mastered on the first attempt. The heater underneath kept the water warm, but added to the electric bill. By the 1980s, the waterbed would fade. In 1975, it was still the future of sleep. Number 87. The Apollo-Soyuz mission. On July 17, 1975, an American foray, Apollo spacecraft, and a Soviet Soyuz spacecraft docked in orbit 140 miles above the Earth, and astronaut Thomas Stafford reached through the hatch and shook the hand of cosmonaut Alexei Leonov. It was the first international crewed space mission, and the symbolism was not subtle. Two nations that had spent 15 years racing each other to the moon were now floating together in the same vehicle, sharing meals and communicating in a mixture of English and Russian that the crews had spent months rehearsing. The handshake was broadcast live on television in both countries. In the United States, the coverage was modest. The moon landing was 6 years old, and the public had largely moved on from space. But for the engineers and diplomats who had spent 3 years negotiating the mission, the image meant everything. Two Cold War rivals proving they could build something together instead of building weapons against each other. Number 86, Jimmy Hoffa. On July 30th, 1975, James Riddle. Hoffa walked into the parking lot of the Macus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, Michigan, and was never seen again. Hoffa was 62 years old. He had spent 5 years in federal prison for jury tampering and had been released in 1971 with the condition that he stay out of union leadership until 1980. He was trying to get back in anyway. The meeting at the Red Fox was supposed to be with 2 men connected to organized crime. Hoffa arrived on time. The men never showed, or they did, depending on which version you believed. By afternoon, his car was still in the parking lot. By evening, his family had called the police. The FBI opened an investigation that would become one of the longest missing person cases in American history. His body has never been found. The parking lot was paved over years ago. Number 85, Captain and Tennille. In 1975, the #1 song in America for the entire year was Love Will Keep Us Together by Captain and Tennille. Daryl Dragon, the captain, was a keyboard player so reserved he wore a captain's hat pulled low over his eyes during every public appearance. Tony Tennille was the voice, the personality, and the reason anyone turned the radio up when the song came on. They had met while working as backup musicians for the Beach Boys, and the chemistry between them was obvious to everyone except, apparently, Daryl, who had to be talked into forming the duo. The song itself was a cover. Neil Sedaka had written it and recorded his own version a year earlier, but the Captain and Tennille arrangement was brighter, faster, and built entirely around Tony's voice in a way that made the original sound like a rough draft. It sold over 4 million copies. It won the Grammy for Record of the Year. It played on AM radio so relentlessly that by September, grocery store clerks and gas station attendants could sing it from memory without meaning to. What made Captain and Tennille unusual in 1975 was the packaging. They were married. They seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company. In a year when the culture was tilting toward disco extravagance and rock star self-destruction, here was a husband and wife act performing on matching stools, smiling through every song. ABC gave them a variety show the following year. It lasted 1 season. The marriage lasted until 2014. Tony later revealed that Daryl had rarely spoken to her off-camera during most of the marriage. The warmth that millions of viewers saw on television and heard on the records was, by her account, almost entirely one-sided. But in the summer of 1975, none of that was visible. They were the happiest couple in America, and nobody had any reason to doubt it. Number 84, the crock pot. Rival Manufacturing had introduced it in 1971, but by 1975, the slow cooker had achieved a kind of kitchen dominance that few appliances ever manage. The device was simple, a ceramic insert inside a metal housing with a heating element that cooked food at low temperatures for 8 to 10 hours. You put in a roast or a stew in the morning, set the dial to low, went to work, and came home to a house that smelled like dinner had been making itself all day. In a year when more women were entering the workforce than at any point in the decade, the crock pot was not just a convenience, it was a negotiation between the old expectations and the new reality. It said the cooking will still happen, but it will happen on its own time, and nobody has to stand at the stove. The cookbooks that accompanied it sold in the millions. Number 83. The pocket calculator. By 1975, the electronic pocket calculator had dropped in price from several $100s to under $20, and the classroom was never the same. Texas Instruments released the TI-30 that year, and suddenly every high school student in America could multiply, divide, and compute square roots by pressing a single button. Teachers were divided. Some embraced the technology as inevitable. Others banned it from their classrooms entirely, arguing that a generation incapable of long division by hand was a generation incapable of serious thought. The debate would last for decades. In 1975, the practical reality was simpler than the argument. A student with a calculator was faster than a student without one, and speed won. The slide rule, which had been standard equipment in shirt pockets and briefcases since the 1940s, became a curiosity within 5 years. Nobody mourned it publicly. Number 82. New York City on the edge of bankruptcy. In the fall of 1975, New York City ran out of money. The city could not pay its bills, could not borrow, and turned to the federal government for help. President Gerald Ford said no. The New York Daily News ran the most famous headline of the decade: "Ford to City, drop dead." Ford later denied using those exact words, but the headline had already done its work. The crisis was years in the making: declining tax revenue, ballooning pension obligations, and a city workforce that had grown faster than the economy supporting it. By October, New York was within hours of defaulting on its bonds. The state stepped in with emergency financing. Ford eventually relented and signed federal loan guarantees in December. The city survived, but the damage ran deep. Layoffs gutted the police force, the fire department, and sanitation. Entire neighborhoods went weeks without consistent garbage pickup. New York City in 1975 was still the greatest city in the world. It just could not afford to prove it. Number 81. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Milos Forman's film adaptation of Ken Kesey's novel opened in November 1975, and Jack Nicholson's performance as Randall Patrick McMurphy became one of the defining screen roles of the decade. The story followed a small-time criminal who fakes mental illness to avoid a prison work farm, only to find himself trapped in a psychiatric ward controlled by the tyrannical nurse, Ratched, played by Louise Fletcher, with a calm that was more frightening than any shout. The film landed in a country deeply skeptical of institutions, and McMurphy's rebellion against the hospital felt like a universal rebellion against something larger. It swept the Academy Awards the following spring, winning Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Screenplay. Only the second film in history to take all 5 major categories. Nicholson had been famous before Cuckoo's Nest. Afterward, he was permanent. Number 80. The $6 Million Man. Steve Austin had been rebuilt by 1975, and every kid in America was running in slow motion across the schoolyard to prove it. Lee Majors played the bionic astronaut on ABC, and the show's formula was perfect for the era. One action sequence per episode in which Austin used his bionic legs, arm, or eye to accomplish something physically impossible, accompanied by the distinctive electronic sound effect that every child could reproduce with their mouth. The show spawned The Bionic Woman with Lindsay Wagner, a line of action figures with removable bionic skin, and a generation of playground debates about whether bionic legs were superior to bionic arms. The opening narration, delivered by Richard Anderson, became one of the most quoted voiceovers on television. "We can rebuild him. We have the technology." In 1975, that sounded less like fiction and more like something America still believed about itself. Number 79. Earth Shoes. The Earth shoe had a heel that sat lower than the toe. That was the entire concept. The negative heel design was based on the theory that walking barefoot on soft ground represented the natural human gait, and the shoe replicated that angle in leather and rubber. Anne Kalso, a Danish yoga instructor, had designed them, and by 1975, the shoes had become a quiet uniform for a particular stripe of the American population: health food store employees, college professors, folk music enthusiasts, and anyone who subscribed to Mother Earth News. They cost around $24 a pair, which was not cheap, and they were not attractive by any conventional standard. The leather was thick, the shape was wide. The sole had a distinctive rocker profile that made new wearers feel like they were permanently walking slightly downhill. Podiatrists debated them. The company filed for bankruptcy in 1977. Number 78. The Jeffersons. On January 18, 1975, George and Louise Jefferson moved out of Archie Bunker's neighborhood and into a luxury apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and a television landmark was born. The Jeffersons was a spin-off of All in the Family, and it ran for 11 seasons, making it one of the longest-running sitcoms with a predominantly black cast in the history of American television. Sherman Hemsley played George Jefferson with a strut and a bark that made him impossible to ignore. Isabel Sanford played Louise with a warmth and steadiness that balanced every one of George's sharp edges. The theme song, written by Jeff Barry and performed by Janet DuBois, had a title that became its own American catchphrase, "Movin' On Up." In 1975, the Jeffersons moving into that apartment felt like more than a plot point. It felt like a door opening. Number 77. The Digital Watch. The first digital watches had appeared in the early 1970s, but they cost hundreds of dollars and displayed the time in dim red LED numbers that drained the battery so quickly you had to press a button just to check the hour. By 1975, the price had dropped far enough for the mass market. Texas Instruments released a digital watch for under $20, and the shift was immediate. The analog watch, with its sweeping hands, suddenly looked like it belonged to an older generation. Teenagers wanted the digital. Office workers wanted the digital. Even people who could not read the tiny red numbers in direct sunlight wanted the digital. It was new, and in 1975, new still meant better without qualification. The idea that anyone might eventually prefer a mechanical watch over an electronic one was, for the moment, genuinely unthinkable. Number 76. Bohemian Rhapsody. Queen released it in October 1975, and no one at the record label knew what to do with it. The song was 5 minutes and 55 seconds long. It had no chorus in any conventional sense. It shifted from a piano ballad to an operatic section with layered vocal harmonies to a hard rock guitar solo to a reflective coda, and the lyrics referenced Galileo, Beelzebub, and the fandango within the same 30-second passage. Radio programmers told EMI the track was too long for airplay. Freddie Mercury told them it was not long enough. There was no compromise. The song aired uncut, climbed to number 1 in the United Kingdom, and became one of the most instantly recognizable recordings in the history of popular music. Miriam. In the United States, it peaked at number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100, which by any standard was an underperformance. America would catch up eventually. The rest of the world already understood what they were hearing. Number 75. Good Times. The sitcom aired on CBS, and by 1975, Jimmy Walker's catchphrase had become so ubiquitous that teachers were banning it from classrooms, and parents were hearing it at the breakfast table before school. Dino Might. Walker played JJ Ivins, the oldest son in a family living in a Chicago housing project, and his rubber-faced delivery turned a single exclamation into the most repeated word of the year. Nah. The show itself was more complicated than the catchphrase suggested. Created by Eric Monty and Mike Evans, it depicted poverty, unemployment, and systemic failure with a directness rare for network television in any decade. Esther Roll and John Amos played the parents with a dignity that grounded every episode in something real, but it was JJ the audience came for. The gap between the show's social ambitions and its most popular character would eventually tear the production apart. In 1975, that tension was still productive, and Good Times was one of the most watched comedies in the country. Number 74. The Church Committee. In January 1975, the United States Senate established a select committee chaired by Frank Church of Idaho to investigate the American intelligence agencies, and what it uncovered was extraordinary. The CIA had been conducting illegal surveillance on American citizens for years. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, had run a domestic counterintelligence program called CONEL-PRO that targeted civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and anyone Hoover considered a threat to social order. The NSA had been intercepting telegrams and cables without warrants. The committee also documented CIA involvement in assassination plots against foreign leaders, including Fidel Castro and Patrice Lumumba. The hearings were televised. The revelations were not rumors or speculation. They were sourced, documented, and confirmed by the agencies themselves under oath. For a nation already shaken by Watergate, the Church Committee was a second strike against the idea that the government could be trusted to police itself. The reforms it produced shaped intelligence oversight for a generation. Number 73. Disco arriving on AM radio. In 1975, disco was no longer a secret. It had been building in the clubs of New York since the early part of the decade, fueled by DJs at underground venues. But the sound had stayed mostly contained within Black, Latino, and gay communities that mainstream radio largely ignored. That changed in 1975. The hustle, get down tonight, that's the way the first Like It, Jive Talkin', and Fly Robin Fly all hit the AM dial in the same calendar year, and suddenly the rhythm was everywhere. Department stores played it, dentist offices played it. Your father hummed it while washing the car on Saturday morning without knowing the song's name. Disco had crossed over, and there was no putting it back. The backlash would arrive spectacularly 4 years later at Comiskey Park in Chicago. But in 1975, disco was still an open invitation, not yet a cultural divide. Number 72. The Sony Betamax. In November 1975, Sony released the Betamax LV-1901 in the United States, a combined television and video cassette recorder housed in a single console. And for the first time in history, an ordinary person could record a television program and watch it later. The machine cost $2,295. The tapes held 1 hour of video. The implications were enormous, and almost nobody grasped them yet. Sony's marketing emphasized a concept the company called time shifting. You recorded a show that aired while you were at work and watched it when you got home. The television networks were horrified. Universal Studios and Walt Disney Productions sued Sony almost immediately, arguing that home recording constituted copyright infringement on a massive scale. The lawsuit would take nearly a decade to reach the Supreme Court, which ultimately ruled in Sony's favor in 1984, establishing the legal right of American consumers to record television broadcasts for personal use. But in 1975, nothing was settled. The LV-1901 sat in the living rooms of early adopters like a piece of furniture from a decade that had not yet arrived. It was large, heavy, and the television and recorder were built into one wooden-paneled cabinet that weighed over 100 pounds. The picture quality was excellent by the standards of the day. The recording capacity was the fatal problem. 1 hour was not enough for a feature film, and Sony's engineers knew it. JVC was already developing a competing format called VHS that could record for 2 hours on a slightly larger cassette. The format war that followed would become one of the most studied business failures in corporate history. Sony had the better technology. JVC had the better runtime. Runtime won. But in November 1975, the Betamax was the only machine of its kind on the consumer market, and owning one meant you had stepped, however awkwardly, into a future that the rest of the country would not reach for another 5 years. Number 71. The Volkswagen Rabbit. In 1975, the Rabbit arrived in American showrooms as the replacement for the Beetle, and the reaction was as divided as any automotive transition in memory. The Beetle had been the people's car for 2 decades, air-cooled, rear-engined, round, and lovable in a way that no focus group could have predicted. The Rabbit was water-cooled, front-engined, angular, and practical in a way that no poem would ever celebrate. It was also significantly better as an automobile. It handled well, it had real interior space. The hatchback was genuinely useful. Volkswagen had hired the Italian designer Giorgetto Giugiaro, and the result was clean, modern, and efficient. The American public was not sure it wanted clean, modern, and efficient. The public had liked the Beetle precisely because it was none of those things. The Rabbit sold well enough, it just never replaced the feeling. Number 70. The capture of Patty Hearst. On September 18, 1975, FBI agents arrested Patty Hearst in a San Francisco apartment 19 months after she had been kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army. The case had consumed the country since February 1974, when the granddaughter of newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst was taken from her Berkeley apartment at gunpoint. What followed defied every prediction. 2 months after the kidnapping, Hearst was photographed holding a carbine rifle during a bank robbery in San Francisco, wearing a beret and calling herself Tanya. The question that divided dinner tables and editorial pages for over a year was whether she had been brainwashed or had crossed over voluntarily. Her arrest in September did not settle it. Her trial the following year did not settle it either. The defense argued coercion. The prosecution argued willing participation. The jury convicted her. President Carter commuted her sentence. President Clinton eventually pardoned her. In 1975, the arrest was simply the latest chapter in a story nobody could fully explain. Number 69. The conversion van. By 1975, the custom van had become the unofficial vehicle of a generation that believed the open road was improved by shag carpet and an airbrush mural. Van conversions were a cottage industry spread across the country. You bought a Ford Econoline or a Dodge B-Series, drove it to a local customizer, and came back a few weeks later to find the interior fitted with captain's chairs, wood grain cabinetry, a fold-down bed, and sometimes a small portable television. The exterior got the mural. Sunsets over mountain ranges, prowling panthers, fantasy castles, and Viking longships were among the favorite subjects, painted across the side panels in colors that had no business on a motor vehicle. The vans showed up at every lake, every campground, and every concert parking lot. They were not practical transportation. They were rolling declarations of personal freedom, averaging 8 miles to the gallon with absolutely no regrets. Number 68. Rocky Horror Picture Show Midnight Screenings. The Rocky Horror Picture Show opened in theaters in August 1975 and flopped immediately. The reviews were unkind. The box office was worse. 20th Century Fox nearly pulled it from distribution entirely. Then something unexpected happened. A handful of late-night screenings in New York and Los Angeles began drawing small, devoted audiences who returned every weekend, dressed as the characters, and shouted responses at the screen. By the end of the year, the midnight screening phenomenon had begun to spread to other cities. Audiences brought props, newspapers to hold over their heads during the rain scene, water guns, slices of toast, bags of rice. They threw them at choreographed moments. They developed call and response lines that existed nowhere in the original script. The film itself was secondary to the experience of being in the theater. Van Vrijdelis. Rocky Horror was not a movie you watched. It was a ritual you joined. It played every Friday and Saturday at midnight in theaters across the country for the next 3 decades. Van Vrijdelis 7. The Beanbag Chair. It was everywhere in 1975. The den, the basement rec room, the college dormitory, the teenager's bedroom. The beanbag chair had no frame, no structure, no back support, and no pretense of sophistication. It was a vinyl shell filled with small polystyrene pellets, and when you dropped into it, the beads shifted around your body, and the chair became whatever shape you happened to be. Getting out was harder than getting in, which was either a design flaw or the entire point, depending on your philosophy. The chairs came in every color available to the vinyl industry. They split at the seams with depressing regularity, releasing thousands of tiny white beads across the carpet, beads that resisted the vacuum, defeated the broom, and continued appearing in the corners of rooms for months. Nobody threw a beanbag chair away on purpose. They all died in active service. Number 66. Tupperware parties. In 1975, if a neighbor invited you to her house on a Tuesday evening, there was a reasonable chance the evening involved Tupperware. The sales model was simple and remarkably effective. A Tupperware dealer, usually a woman working from her own home, hosted a product demonstration in her living room. She showed the containers, she demonstrated the patented seal, she passed around the catalog. The guests placed orders. The hostess earned free products based on the group's total sales. It was a direct sales system that predated every modern version of the concept, and it worked because the product was genuinely well made and the social pressure was gentle enough to feel like hospitality rather than commerce. The famous Tupperware burp, the sound the lid made when you pressed the air out of the container, was demonstrated at every party like a small act of engineering theater. By 1975, Tupperware was a billion-dollar company built almost entirely on the living rooms of American women. Number 65. Casey and the Sunshine Band. Harry Wayne Casey was a 24-year-old from Hialeah, Florida, who had spent his teenage years hanging around the warehouse of TK Records until somebody let him into the studio. By 1975, he had written and performed two of the biggest songs of the year, Get Down Tonight and That's the Way, the First Like It. Both reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Both were built on the same reliable formula: a driving bass line, a horn section carrying the melody, and a chorus simple enough that anyone could sing along after a single listen. Casey and the Sunshine Band were never critical favorites. No serious rock magazine put them on the cover. But they moved people onto dance floors with a consistency that few acts in any genre have ever matched. In 1975, the Sunshine Band was the sound of Friday night in America, and Friday night did not need a review. Number 64. The console television. In 1975, the television set in most American living rooms was not sitting on a stand or mounted on a wall. It was a piece of furniture in its own right. The console television sat on the floor like a credenza, encased in a cabinet of walnut or dark oak veneer, with the screen recessed behind a decorative frame and the speakers hidden behind fabric grills on either side. Some models had hinged doors that closed over the screen when the set was turned off, converting it back into a respectable piece of living room cabinetry that could face company without embarrassment. The idea that a television should look like a television had not yet arrived. In 1975, a television was still expected to blend into a room where adults entertained. Thus, the Muchek console weighed between 150 and 250 pounds, which meant that once it was positioned in its corner of the room, it stayed there until the family moved or the picture tube failed, whichever happened first. Number 63. The Pontiac Firebird Trans Am. The 1975 Trans Am came in several colors, but only two mattered: white with blue trim and black with gold trim. The black and gold version, with the massive Screaming Eagle decal spread across the entire hood, became one of the most recognizable automobiles of the decade, though its full cultural moment would arrive 2 years later when Burt Reynolds drove one across the screen in Smokey and the Bandit. In 1975, the Trans Am was already the car that every teenage boy in America wanted and almost none could afford or insure. It carried the 455 cubic inch V8 in its final year of availability, a shaker hood scoop that vibrated with the engine, and an exhaust note that announced your arrival from several blocks away. Emissions regulations had taken some of the raw horsepower out by 1975, but nobody buying a Trans Am was reading the spec sheet. They were responding to the sound, the stance, and that enormous golden bird on the hood. The bird was the whole sale. Number 62. Monty Python and the Holy Grail. The film arrived in American theaters in the spring of 1975 and divided audiences into two distinct camps: people who considered it the funniest motion picture they had ever seen, and people who left the theater confused. There was almost no middle ground. The production budget was roughly 229,000 British pounds, which was modest even by the standards of the day, and the shortage of money became inseparable from the comedy. The knights rode imaginary horses while servants behind them clapped coconut shells together. The Black Knight lost all 4 limbs in combat and declared it merely a flesh wound. A killer rabbit guarded a cave with lethal efficiency. French soldiers taunted King Arthur from a castle rampart with insults that followed no known logic. American college students adopted the film immediately and completely. They quoted entire scenes to each other in dining halls, dormitory lounges, and house parties, and they continued doing so for the next 5 decades without any sign of stopping. Number 61. John Denver. In 1975, John Denver was not just popular, he was inescapable. Not in the way a rock star was inescapable, with controversy and tabloid coverage. In the way a warm breeze was inescapable, present in every room without anyone having opened a window. He was on the radio with Calypso, Thank God I'm a Country Boy, and I'm Sorry, all 3 of which reached number 1 that year. He hosted television specials with a sincerity so complete it baffled cynics. He wore round, wire-rimmed glasses, kept a bowl haircut that had not changed since the 1960s, and sang in a tenor voice that sounded like sunlight filtered through a screen door on a summer afternoon. His music was gentle, melodic, and entirely free of danger, which made it either profoundly comforting or profoundly irritating depending on your relationship with sincerity. Denver outsold every other recording artist in the United States in 1975. The rock establishment never quite forgave him for it. Number 60. The Wicker Peacock Chair. Every portrait photographer in America seemed to own one by 1975. The peacock chair was a high-backed wicker throne that fanned out behind the seated person like an enormous halo, and it appeared in professional studios, senior yearbook photos, family portraits, and living room corners with a frequency that suggested someone had issued a national directive. The chair originated in Southeast Asia and arrived in American homes through import shops and mail-order catalogs. It was not particularly comfortable. The wicker pressed crosshatch patterns into the backs of bare arms, and the tall fan back caught every breeze and draft in the room. But it photographed remarkably well. Anyone seated in a peacock chair looked at least slightly regal, which was the entire point of owning one. By 1975, the chair had completed its migration from bohemian statement piece to suburban living room prop, and it remained a fixture in portrait studios well into the following decade. Number 59. Earth, Wind and Fire. Morris White had built Earth, Wind and Fire into one of the most ambitious live acts in American music by 1975. The album That's the Way of the World, released in March, went to number 1 on the Billboard chart and produced Shining Star, the group's first number 1 single. What separated Earth, Wind and Fire from every other group on the radio was the sheer range of what they attempted. They played funk, soul, jazz, rock, and disco, sometimes within the same song, and the live performances featured stage pyrotechnics, levitating piano platforms, and costume changes that anticipated arena spectacle by nearly a decade. Philip Bailey's soaring falsetto layered over Maurice White's anchoring baritone created a vocal combination that no competing act could reproduce. In a year when popular music was fracturing into hostile camps, Earth, Wind and Fire declined to join any of them. Number 58. The Bicentennial Minute. Beginning on July 4, 1974, and running every single night for 2 full years through July 4, 1976, CBS broadcast a 60-second segment called The Bicentennial Minute. A different American public figure appeared each evening, stood before a simple backdrop, and told the audience one event that had occurred on that exact calendar date in American history, precisely 200 years earlier. The segment aired just before the late local news. It lasted exactly 1 minute. Walter Cronkite narrated the opening theme. The presenters ranged from United States senators and former astronauts to actors, athletes, and cabinet members, and each delivered a brief script describing a colonial-era event tied to that night's date: a skirmish, a legislative vote, a treaty negotiation, a merchant's price list, a census figure. The Bicentennial Minute was the most consistent piece of daily programming on American television in 1975, and it reflected a national mood that is genuinely difficult to convey to anyone who did not experience it firsthand. The United States was preparing for its 200th birthday, and the preparation was earnest. There was almost no irony in it. Cities and towns formed bicentennial planning committees. Schools organized bicentennial art projects and essay contests. The post office issued bicentennial stamps. The American Revolution Bicentennial Administration, a federal agency created for the sole purpose of coordinating the celebration, maintained offices in every state. Fire hydrants were painted red, white, and blue in neighborhoods across the country. So were mailboxes, fence posts, barn doors, and front porches. The enthusiasm was genuine, widespread, and building steadily toward July 4th, 1976, a date that the entire country already understood would be the largest national celebration in living memory.
Citation coin tour.
In 1975, the Bicentennial Minute was the nightly drumroll, 60 seconds of American history delivered into the living room every evening, counting backward through the revolution one day at a time, building toward a birthday that the nation, for once, seemed to universally agree was worth celebrating. Number 57. The Equal Rights Amendment. By 1975, the ERA was the most fiercely debated piece of proposed legislation in the country. The text was brief. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress had approved it in 1972 and sent it to the states for ratification. By 1975, 34 of the required 38 states had voted to ratify, and the momentum appeared to favor passage. Then Phyllis Schlafly organized. The conservative activist from Alton, Illinois, built a grassroots opposition movement called Stop ERA that argued the amendment would eliminate legal protections for women, mandate unisex public bathrooms, and expose women to the military draft. The debate divided households, congregations, and political parties. Women who had stood together a decade earlier found themselves on opposite sides of a line neither had expected to draw. The amendment never reached 38 states. The deadline expired in 1982. In 1975, both sides still believed their victory was inevitable. Number 56. Werner Erhard's EST training. In 1975, EST was the self-improvement phenomenon that respectable professionals refused to discuss at the office and could not stop describing at dinner parties. The training consisted of 2 consecutive weekends, roughly 60 hours of total seat time, during which participants sat in a hotel ballroom and were confronted, challenged, and occasionally shouted at by a trainer who insisted that everything they believed about their lives was a story they had constructed to avoid taking responsibility. You could not leave the room during sessions. Bathroom breaks were strictly scheduled. The stated goal was to get it, a phrase that was never precisely defined and was not meant to be. Roughly 500,000 Americans completed the EST training between 1971 and 1984. Some described it as the most transformative experience of their lives. Others called it a psychological pressure cooker. Nearly everyone agreed it was expensive. The fee in 1975 was $250 for the 2 weekends, which was not a small amount of money. Number 55. Barney Miller. The show premiered on ABC in January 1975, set almost entirely inside the squad room of a fictional police precinct in Greenwich Village, and it accomplished something that no other cop show of the era attempted. It was deliberately, purposefully undramatic. There were no car chases. There were no gun battles. There was a coffee pot that produced a brown liquid everyone drank and no one could honestly say they enjoyed. Hale Linden played Captain Barney Miller with a weary, rumpled patience that felt like the actual texture of institutional life rather than a television version of it. The crimes that came through the precinct door were small. The suspects were recognizably human. The detectives were civil servants filling out paperwork and waiting for their shift to end. The show ran for 8 seasons and won multiple Emmy Awards, and television critics regularly named it the most realistic depiction of police work ever aired on American broadcast television. The precinct never changed. The coffee never got any better. Number 54. The Harvest Gold Kitchen. In 1975, the American kitchen had a color, and that color was harvest gold. It appeared on refrigerators, stoves, dishwashers, and countertop appliances with a uniformity that suggested someone in authority had issued a decree. General Electric, Frigidaire, Whirlpool, and every other major appliance manufacturer offered their complete product lines in harvest gold, and homeowners purchased them in coordinated sets because placing a harvest gold refrigerator next to an almond-colored stove was regarded as a serious decorating failure. The gold was paired with dark wood cabinetry, earth-toned wallpaper featuring mushroom or wheat motifs, and linoleum in a complementary shade. The combined effect was warm, enclosed, and unmistakably mid-decade. Nobody selected harvest gold because it was thrilling. They chose it because it was the palette of the era, and deviating from that palette in 1975 required more decorating confidence than most American kitchens could muster. Number 53. The Bowling Alley. In 1975, the local bowling alley was still one of the primary gathering places in American social life. Not because bowling itself was a riveting spectator experience, but because the bowling alley was the closest thing many communities had to a public recreation center that stayed open at night, served hot food, and did not require a membership fee. League nights ran from September through April. Teams wore matching shirts with the bowler's name embroidered above the breast pocket and a local sponsor's logo across the back. The shoes were rented from a counter near the front door. The balls were communal property. Scoring was done by hand on translucent paper sheets displayed on an overhead projector above the lane, and disagreements about spare conversions were settled by the team captain with a finality that no instant replay could have challenged. The snack bar sold hamburgers, nachos, and draft beer in waxed paper cups. A strike sent a sound rolling through the building like a small, contained detonation. Nobody visited the bowling alley looking for solitude. Number 52. The Waltons. By 1975, The Waltons was deep into its 3rd season on CBS and drawing an audience of over 30 million viewers every Thursday night. The show was set during the Great Depression in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, and its appeal was deceptively simple. A large family that loved each other, worked hard, lived honestly, and resolved their troubles through conversation rather than crisis. Richard Thomas played John Boy, the eldest son and aspiring writer, and the goodnight ritual that closed every episode became one of the most imitated and most sincerely beloved moments in television history. The final image each week showed the lights going out one window at a time in the Walton farmhouse on the mountain, and the family's voices calling goodnight to each other across the dark rooms. It was a lullaby broadcast to the entire country. In 1975, over 30 million people ended their Thursday evenings watching a family say goodnight to each other, and a meaningful number of them slept better for it. Number 51. The Thrilla in Manila. On October 1, 1975, Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier met for the 3rd and final time inside a covered arena in Quezon City in the Philippines, and produced what many boxing historians regard as the greatest prize fight ever contested. The temperature inside the venue exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Ali, who had subjected Frazier to cruel taunts during the pre-fight promotion, dominated the early rounds with a punishing jab. Frazier stormed back through the middle rounds with left hooks to the body that buckled Ali visibly. By the 12th round, both fighters were operating on instinct alone. Ali said afterward that the fight was the closest he had ever come to dying. Frazier's trainer, Eddie Futch, stopped the fight before the 15th round when Frazier's left eye had swollen entirely shut. Ali collapsed in his corner the moment the decision was announced. Neither man was ever quite the same fighter afterward. The rivalry had taken everything both of them had to give, and it gave nothing back. Number 50. The television station signing off at midnight. In 1975, television did not run all night. Sometime between midnight and 1 in the morning, the local station played the national anthem over a waving American flag, displayed a test pattern or a still image of its broadcast tower, and then the screen went to static. That was it. Broadcasting was finished for the day. If you were still awake at 2 in the morning, your television had nothing left to offer but a high-pitched tone and a field of gray snow. The sign-off was a nightly ritual that most people never witnessed because they were already asleep. But for the insomniacs, the night shift workers, and the teenagers who had stayed up past curfew, it was a strangely specific experience. The anthem played. The flag filled the screen. Then the picture collapsed into noise, and the house felt emptier than it had a moment before. The darkness after the sign-off was a particular kind of American quiet that no longer exists. Anyone who ever stayed up late enough to see the station sign off was part of a club that never had a name. Number 49. Sanford and Son. Red Fox played Fred Sanford, a cantankerous junk dealer in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles. And by 1975, the show was in its 4th season on NBC and consistently among the highest-rated programs on the network. The premise was straightforward. Fred and his grown son Lamont operated a salvage yard, and every week Fred found a new way to avoid honest work, manipulate his son's plans, and clutch his chest in an elaborate fake heart attack while calling out to his deceased wife, "Elizabeth, I'm coming to join you, honey." The line became one of the most quoted phrases on American television. What the audience sometimes overlooked was the craft underneath. The show was adapted from Steptoe and Son, a BBC series, and Fox brought a nightclub veteran's sense of timing to network television, testing the censor's limits and frequently winning. Sanford and Son made Red Fox a name known in every American household. Before the show, he had been a legend only in rooms that most of those households never visited.
Number 48. The Ford Pinto.
By 1975, the Ford Pinto had sold over 1 million units and earned a place in the American automotive landscape that would haunt the Ford Motor Company for the rest of the century. The subcompact had been rushed to market in 1971 to compete with Japanese and German imports, and internal company documents later revealed that Ford's engineers knew the fuel tank, mounted directly behind the rear axle without adequate shielding, was dangerously vulnerable to rupture in rear-end collisions. The cost of reinforcing the tank was estimated at $11 per vehicle. Ford performed a cost-benefit analysis that weighed the expense of the fix against the projected expense of settling burn injury lawsuits and death claims, and the company chose not to make the modification. That calculation, laid out in an internal memorandum that eventually became public, turned into one of the most cited examples in American business ethics of corporate math applied to human life: money. In 1975, the full story had not yet broken. The Pinto was simply an inexpensive car with decent fuel economy. The investigative journalism and the lawsuits were still 2 years away. The $11 fix became a parable that business schools would teach for decades. Number 47. The Chevrolet Vega. Chevrolet had introduced the Vega in 1971 as the answer to the import invasion, and by 1975, the car had answered the question with an automobile that rusted faster than nearly anything else on the American road. The engine block was cast from aluminum with iron-plated cylinder walls, a weight-saving design that created mechanical problems General Motors never managed to resolve. The cylinder linings wore unevenly. Head gaskets failed prematurely. Oil consumption climbed with every passing mile. Owners in the northern states watched the fender panels develop rust holes before the odometer reached 30,000. Consumer Reports rated it among the worst vehicles in its category year after year. Despite all of this, the Vega sold in respectable numbers in 1975 because gasoline was expensive and the Vega was cheap and returned acceptable mileage on the highway. It was not a good car by any honest measure. It was a necessary one, and in 1975, necessity was doing most of the selling. Number 46. The rec room in the basement. In 1975, the finished basement was where the real living happened. The rec room was typically paneled from floor to ceiling in dark imitation wood, usually a pressed board product with a printed grain pattern that fooled nobody but offended nobody either. The floor was covered in indoor-outdoor carpeting in brown or dark green. The furniture was whatever the living room had discarded when the new set arrived upstairs. A plaid sofa past its prime, a mismatched armchair, and a coffee table bearing the rings of a decade of beverages set down without coasters. A pool table or foosball table occupied the center if the budget allowed, a card table if it did not. The rec room smelled faintly of basement dampness regardless of season. It was where teenagers brought friends, where fathers watched the game undisturbed, and where the family played board games on rainy weekends. It was the most honest room in the house. Number 45. Wheel of Fortune. The show premiered on NBC's daytime schedule on January 6, 1975, hosted by Chuck Woolery with Susan Stafford turning the letterboards by hand, and the concept was so elementally simple that its extraordinary longevity probably should have been predictable from the start. Contestants spun a large carnival-style wheel divided into dollar amounts, called out a consonant, and hoped it appeared somewhere in a hidden phrase displayed on a board of blank tiles. Correct letters earned money. Wrong guesses lost a turn. You could buy a vowel for $250. That was the entire game. The set was modestly built. The prizes included kitchen appliances, luggage sets, and dining room furniture displayed on a small rotating stage. The hidden phrases were common expressions that any English speaker would recognize with enough letters revealed. Nothing about the premiere suggested that Wheel of Fortune would become the longest-running syndicated game show in American television history, still airing more than 50 years later with no sign of stopping. But the format had tapped into something fundamental about the viewing experience. The game required no specialized knowledge. It demanded no physical ability. It asked only that you could identify a familiar phrase with a handful of consonants showing, which was something nearly every viewer watching from home believed they could accomplish faster than the contestants standing at the wheel. That confidence was the engine. The absolute certainty of shouting the correct answer at the television screen a full 3 seconds before the contestant solved it made every viewer feel sharper than the person on camera. No other program in the history of American television has generated as many simultaneous arguments between married couples who both knew the answer and both believed they identified it first. The daytime version drew a loyal if modest audience through the late 1970s. The syndicated evening edition, launched in 1983 with Pat Sajak and Vanna White, transformed the show into a national institution that outlasted every competitor. But the wheel was already spinning on January 6, 1975, and America was already shouting from the couch. Number 44. The Lasboy Recliner. By 1975, the Lasboy had secured a position in the American living room that no competing piece of furniture could seriously challenge. The chair came in upholstery fabrics ranging from earth-tone plaid to rust-colored velour, and the mechanism was simple. Pull the wooden lever on the side, the padded footrest swings upward, and the backrest reclines to a position roughly halfway between sitting upright and lying flat. That halfway position was the entire reason for the chair's existence. The Lasboy was not designed for conversation or entertaining or concentrated reading. It was designed for a single activity, watching television in a state of nearly total physical surrender. The chair was heavy enough that relocating it required 2 adults and a plan discussed in advance. Once positioned in front of the television set, it stayed there permanently. In millions of American households, the Lasboy was not furniture. It was territory, and the person who claimed it first each evening held it without negotiation. Number 43. Dog Day Afternoon. Sidney Lumet's film opened in September 1975, and Al Pacino's performance as Sonny Wartzik, a desperate man who attempts to rob a Brooklyn bank to pay for his partner's sex reassignment surgery, became one of the most discussed screen performances of the year. The story was based on a real incident that had taken place in August 1972, and Lumet shot it with a documentary rawness that blurred the line between cinema and reportage. The robbery goes wrong within minutes. The police surround the building. A crowd of bystanders assembles on the street and begins cheering for the robber. The boundary between criminal and folk hero dissolves in the summer heat. Pacino's Attica chant, shouted through the bank's front door at the police line while the crowd roars approval, became one of the decade's most quoted and most disturbing movie moments. The film earned 6 Academy Award nominations. It captured something true about mid-1970s New York, a city so frayed at every edge that a bank robber could become a sympathetic figure before lunchtime. Number 42. The Polaroid SX70. The camera had been on the market since 1972, but by 1975, the SX70 had become the defining instrument of instant photography for the American consumer. You pointed the camera, pressed the red shutter button, and a white-bordered photograph emerged from the slot in the front of the body and developed right there in your hands over the next several minutes. No dark room. No film canister to drop off at the drugstore counter. No week of waiting. The image materialized before your eyes like a slow chemical revelation, and the ritual of watching a Polaroid print develop, shaking it gently in the air, though Polaroid's official position was that shaking made no difference, became one of the signature gestures of the decade. The SX70 folded flat into a shape roughly the size of a thick hardcover book. It was a triumph of industrial design. Edwin Land, Polaroid's founder and chief inventor, had envisioned a camera so intuitive that a child could operate it on the first try. By 1975, millions of American children were proving him right every weekend. Number 41. The Fleetwood Mac album. The self-titled Fleetwood Mac record, released in July 1975, is one of the most consequential albums in rock history that almost nobody discusses as a standalone achievement. Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks had just joined the band, replacing the departing Bob Welch, and the creative chemistry between them was immediate and electric. The album produced 2 radio hits, Rhiannon and Over My Head, that introduced the reconfigured lineup to the American listening public. It climbed to number 1 on the Billboard album chart and eventually sold over 5 million copies. But it exists almost permanently in the shadow of what came next. Rumors, released in early 1977, sold over 40 million copies worldwide and became one of the best-selling albums ever recorded. In retrospect, the 1975 album was the foundation. It was the record that proved these 5 musicians belonged in the same studio, that Buckingham's layered guitar work and Nicks's smoky vocal presence and the Fleetwood McVie rhythm section could cohere into something genuinely new. Without the self-titled album, Rumors never happens. It is the opening act that made the headliner inevitable. Number 40. Transcendental Meditation. By 1975, TM had completed its migration from countercultural curiosity to mainstream American self-improvement practice. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi had introduced the technique to Western audiences in the early 1960s, and the Beatles' widely publicized visit to his ashram in Rishikesh in 1968 had supplied it with celebrity credibility that no advertising budget could have purchased. The real expansion, however, came in the 1970s, when TM instructional centers opened in cities and suburban strip malls across the country and offered introductory lectures in hotel conference rooms, college auditoriums, and church fellowship halls. The sales pitch was disarmingly simple. Sit quietly for 20 minutes twice a day. Silently repeat a personal mantra assigned by a certified instructor and experience reduced stress, sharper concentration, and a measurable state of restful alertness that carried into the rest of the day. The introductory course cost roughly $125. By 1975, over 1 million Americans had been initiated into the practice. Physicians recommended it to patients with high blood pressure. Corporations offered it as a workplace wellness benefit. TM had become so thoroughly domesticated and respectable that it was almost dull, which the Maharishi would have said was the entire point. Number 39. The trash compactor. The residential trash compactor arrived in the American kitchen in the early 1970s, and by 1975 had become one of those built-in appliances that home builders included in new construction because the sales brochure declared the modern kitchen incomplete without one. The device occupied the space of a standard cabinet, usually next to the dishwasher. You loaded household garbage into a metal-lined drawer, closed it, and pressed a switch. A hydraulic ram descended and crushed everything inside to roughly a quarter of its original volume. The compressed block was sealed in a specially designed bag and carried to the curb. In theory, the compactor reduced the number of garbage bags a household used per week. In practice, it flattened tin cans into broken glass, drove food remnants into crevices that could never be adequately cleaned, and produced a compressed brick of refuse that weighed enough to strain a forearm. The majority of families who installed one in 1975 quietly stopped using it within a few years. The compactor door stayed closed, and the space behind it became storage for baking sheets. Number 38. The Princess Telephone. By 1975, the Princess phone had been in production for well over a decade, and it had claimed a permanent place on the nightstand of the American teenager's bedroom. It was compact, oval-shaped, and available in colors that no office telephone would ever consider: pink, light blue, turquoise, and ivory. The rotary dial was recessed into the base of the phone, which meant you had to flip the entire handset upside down to dial a number and then turn it back over to speak. An illuminated dial ring glowed softly at night, marketed by AT&T as a convenience feature but functioning primarily as a nightlight for the 13-year-old who was not supposed to be making telephone calls after 9 o'clock. The Princess was not cheap to rent. AT&T charged a monthly surcharge on top of the standard telephone line fee for the privilege of owning a colored telephone with a light in it. Families paid the extra charge because the alternative was a nightly argument that proved more expensive in every other way. Number 37. The flip number alarm clock. The flip clock sat on the nightstand in nearly every American bedroom by 1975. The time was displayed on individual cards mounted on a rotating drum inside the housing, and as each minute passed, the current numeral card dropped forward with a quiet mechanical snap, and the next one fell into position behind it. The sound was distinctive, a soft plastic click, once every 60 seconds, audible in a dark room if you were lying awake and listening for it. The hour drum rotated more slowly. AM and PM were indicated by a small dot or tab visible through a tiny window in the corner of the display. Most models had no snooze function. The alarm was an electric buzzer that began at an unpleasant volume and maintained that volume without mercy until you physically toggled the switch on top of the unit. Some versions included a built-in AM radio as an alarm alternative. The Panasonic and General Electric models dominated the market. The flip clock was not elegant. It was reliable, readable in low light, and it lost no time because it ran on household current rather than batteries. Number 36. The sunken living room. The sunken living room was one of the defining architectural gestures of the 1970s American home, and by 1975, any residence with pretensions to modern style included one. You descended 2 or 3 steps from the main floor level into a conversation area that felt separated from the rest of the house without being enclosed by walls. The visual effect was striking. A visitor entered the home, turned the corner, and the floor dropped away into a carpeted gathering space bordered by built-in seating or a wraparound sectional in earth tones, with a stone or brick fireplace serving as the anchor. The sunken living room made every social gathering feel slightly more intentional and sophisticated, or at least that was the ambition. The practical reality included drinks that spilled and ran downhill toward the center of the room, elderly guests who navigated the step change with visible anxiety, and at least one person per gathering who forgot the floor dropped and stumbled. The sunken living room looked spectacular in a magazine photograph. In daily life, it was a conversation starter and an insurance claim waiting to happen. Number 35. The wet bar in the den. By 1975, no properly finished den or family room in a middle-class American home was considered complete without a wet bar. The typical installation was modest, a short stretch of Formica countertop with a small sink connected to the plumbing, a few open shelves behind it for liquor bottles, and a row of matching cocktail glasses suspended upside down from a wooden or brass rack mounted to the wall. Need more? Elaborate versions included an under-counter refrigerator, an insulated ice bucket, and a padded vinyl bar top with brass tack trim. The concept was that a man could walk into his own den after a day at the office, fix himself an old-fashioned or a scotch and water without setting foot in the kitchen, and settle into his chair in front of the television with the quiet contentment of a person who had everything necessary within arm's reach. The wet bar made the den a sovereign territory. Whether the drinks it produced justified the plumbing work is a question the 1970s preferred not to examine closely. Number 34. Elton John. In 1975, Elton John was operating at a level of sustained commercial dominance that few musicians in any era have achieved. The album Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy, released in May, became the first album in the history of the Billboard chart to debut at number 1 in its first week. Philadelphia Freedom had already been a massive hit earlier that spring. Island Girl climbed to number 1 in October. He performed at Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles wearing a sequined Dodgers uniform and rhinestone-studded platform boots before a sold-out crowd that confirmed what the record sales had already proven. Elton John was the biggest live act on the planet. The costumes were growing more extravagant with every tour. The oversized eyeglasses had become a visual signature as instantly recognizable as any melody he had ever composed. Underneath the spectacle, the songwriting collaboration with Bernie Taupin continued to produce work of genuine emotional complexity. Captain Fantastic was a semi-autobiographical concept album tracing their early years of struggle in London. It was simultaneously the most personal and the most commercially successful record of their partnership. Number 33. The Evel Knievel Stunt Cycle. If you were a child in 1975, there was a reasonable chance that Evel Knievel's stunt cycle was the single most important object under your roof. Ideal Toys manufactured it, and the concept was brilliantly simple. A small plastic motorcycle with a miniature Knievel figure attached, mounted on a gyroscopic launcher powered by a hand crank. You turned the crank as fast as your arm allowed, pressed the release lever, and the motorcycle shot forward across the floor, up a plastic ramp, and through the air with enough force to clear a row of Matchbox cars, a stack of books, or, depending on your ambition and your household's tolerance for risk, a sleeping family pet. The real Evel Knievel jumped school buses and canyon rims and spent large portions of his career in various states of fracture recovery. The toy version gave every 7-year-old in America the opportunity to replicate the spectacle on the kitchen floor without medical consequences. The stunt cycle was the best-selling toy of the 1975 holiday season. Every child wanted one. A significant number of them got one, and the crank handle broke on most of them within 6 months. Number 32. Legs Pantyhose. In 1975, Legs Pantyhose came packaged inside a white plastic egg. That was the marketing breakthrough, and it was quietly brilliant. The egg-shaped container sat in a freestanding wire display rack positioned near the checkout counter of grocery stores, drugstores, and discount retailers, placing pantyhose directly in the path of women who were already shopping for other things rather than requiring a separate trip to the department store hosiery counter. The egg itself was smooth, white, and roughly the size of a real egg, though considerably sturdier. Inside was a pair of sheer pantyhose in one of several skin tone shades, folded compactly into the oval shell. The eggs were intended to be disposable. In practice, the Alleg's egg became one of the most repurposed containers in American household history. Families used them to store sewing notions, Christmas tree ornaments, loose coins, small toys, buttons, and Easter candy. The pantyhose were the product Hanes was selling. The egg turned out to be the thing people remembered. Number 31. The banana seat bicycle. The chopper-style bicycle with the banana seat was the default mode of transportation for every American child old enough to ride and too young to drive in 1975. The seat was long, narrow, and curved upward at the rear like the fruit it was named for. The handlebars rose high above the grips, sometimes extravagantly so, reaching well past the rider's shoulders in the ape-hanger style that looked fast even when the bike was standing still. The front wheel was frequently smaller than the rear. A chrome sissy bar extended up behind the seat, nominally for the benefit of a second rider but used primarily as a backrest for the operator who was coasting with no hands, which was every operator eventually. The bikes came from Schwinn, Huffy, and Murray, finished in metallic flake paint schemes that favored purple, green, and burnt orange. Banana seat bicycles were not aerodynamic, not particularly fast, and not designed with any input from orthopedic specialists. They were the most fun a 10-year-old could have without adult involvement. And in 1975, that was the only product specification that mattered. Number 30. Jiffy Pop. Jiffy Pop was a flat aluminum pan with a crimped foil lid, preloaded with popcorn kernels and oil, and the ritual of preparing it on the stovetop in 1975 was one of the great small suspense stories of American kitchen life. You placed the pan on a burner over medium heat and held it by the folding wire handle, shaking it back and forth in a slow, steady motion, and then you waited. For the first 45 seconds, nothing happened. The oil heated silently beneath the sealed foil. Then the first kernel popped, a single muffled detonation from inside the closed pan, and the foil lid, which had been lying flat and smooth across the top, pushed upward by a fraction of an inch. Indecision, second pop, followed almost immediately, then a third. Then the popping accelerated into a continuous barrage, and the foil expanded into a silver dome that swelled to 3 or 4 times the original height of the pan, inflating like a metallic balloon right there over the burner. The trick, known to every family that had ever burned a batch, was judging the precise moment to pull it off the heat. Remove it too early, and half the kernels at the bottom were still unpopped. Leave it too long, and the bottom layer scorched, filling the kitchen with an acrid smoke that embedded itself in the curtains and lingered for days. When you timed it correctly, you peeled back the hot foil and found a pan overflowing with fresh popcorn, glistening with butter and dusted with salt, and it tasted better than anything that had ever emerged from a bag. Partly because of the seasoning and partly because you had just watched the entire production from start to finish. Jiffy Pop was theater disguised as a snack food. The popcorn was the reward for sitting through the performance. The microwave oven had not yet arrived in most American kitchens. Microwave popcorn did not exist. In 1975, if you wanted popcorn at home on a Friday night, Jiffy Pop was the event, and that slowly expanding silver dome was the show. Number 29. The Cuisinart Food Processor. Carl Sontheimer, a retired electronics engineer with a passion for French cooking, introduced the Cuisinart food processor to the American public at a Chicago housewares trade show in 1973. By 1975, the machine had become the most coveted kitchen appliance among serious home cooks, and the most bewildering one among everyone else. The Cuisinart could chop, slice, shred, puree, mix, and knead bread dough, and it performed all of these tasks with a speed that was genuinely startling the first time you witnessed it. An entire onion disappeared into the work bowl in 3 seconds. A block of Parmesan became a pile of fine shreds in 2. Nam dar chumdalur Ford. Daron slin lakwa hofkadi. Machine also cost around $140, which was considerably more than most Americans were accustomed to paying for any countertop appliance. and the blade assembly required reading an instruction manual that assumed a level of mechanical confidence not every home cook possessed. Julia Child demonstrated the Cuisinart on her television program. That single endorsement moved more units than every print advertisement the company ever placed. Number 28. The Singles Bar. By 1975, the Singles Bar had become both an American institution and a reliable national punchline, often in the same conversation. The concept required no explanation. A bar whose primary social function was facilitating introductions between unattached adults with no pretense of any other purpose. The lighting was kept deliberately low. The drinks were priced higher than the neighborhood average. The music was loud enough to require leaning in close to hold a conversation, which was understood by all parties to be the architectural point of the volume. A Friday night at a Singles Bar in 1975 followed a specific choreography. Women arrived in groups of 2 or 3 and claimed a table or a section of the bar. Men arrived solo or in pairs and positioned themselves within visual range. Eye contact was established across the room. Someone ordered a drink for someone else through the bartender. A conversation began. Some of those conversations ended in marriages that lasted decades. A considerably larger number ended in awkward drives home and Monday morning regrets. The Singles Bar was the dating app of 1975. It was slower, louder, more expensive, and required substantially more nerve. Number 27. The Altair 8800. In January 1975, the cover of Popular Electronics magazine featured a small blue metal box with rows of toggle switches and blinking red lights on the front panel, and the headline announced what it called a breakthrough. The world's first mini-computer kit available to hobbyists for under $400. The Altair 8800, manufactured by a tiny company called MITS operating out of Albuquerque, New Mexico, was not a computer in any sense that a person living today would recognize. It had no monitor, it had no keyboard, it had no stored software. Programming it required toggling switches in binary sequences and interpreting the output by reading patterns of blinking indicator lights. By any practical daily measure, the machine was useless. And yet, 2 young programmers named Bill Gates and Paul Allen read that magazine cover, wrote a version of the basic programming language for the Altair within weeks, and founded a small partnership they called Microsoft. The personal computer revolution that would eventually reorganize every aspect of American commerce, communication, education, and entertainment began, arguably with an aluminum box on a magazine cover that could do nothing a $5 pocket calculator could not already accomplish faster. Number 26. 2. Assassination attempts on Gerald Ford in 17 days. On September 5, 1975, a woman named Lynette Frum, known as Squeaky, a devoted follower of Charles Manson, pointed a loaded Colt .45 pistol at President Gerald Ford as he walked through a public park on the grounds of the California State Capitol in Sacramento.
Namanama, Ninenama Minanama, Danganami Hame Samantang, Den Char them Mamano.
A Secret Service agent seized the weapon before it could discharge. Ford was shaken but physically unharmed. 17 days later, on September 22nd, a woman named Sarah Jane Moore fired a .38 caliber revolver at Ford as he exited the St. Francis Hotel in downtown San Francisco. The bullet missed by several feet. A bystander in the crowd, a former Marine named Oliver Sipple, lunged at Moore and deflected her arm before she could fire a second round. Ford was again uninjured. 2 assassination attempts on the same sitting president, in the same state, in the same month, both carried out by women acting independently of each other. There was no precedent. The country had absorbed too much by 1975 to sustain another national trauma. Ford adjusted his schedule. The Secret Service rewrote its protocols. The decade continued. Number 25. The Stepford Wives. Ira Levin's 1972 novel became a motion picture in February 1975, directed by Brian Forbes, and the word Stepford entered the American language as a permanent adjective before most people had even seen the film. The premise was as unsettling as anything Hollywood produced that decade. The women of a quiet Connecticut suburb are methodically replaced by compliant, immaculately groomed, robotically obedient replicas created by their own husbands. Catherine Ross played the young wife who moves to Stepford and gradually realizes that the neighborhood women are too agreeable, too perfectly domestic, and too enthusiastic about household cleaning products to be entirely human. The film was marketed as a psychological thriller, but was received by audiences as a feminist parable. The timing could not have been sharper. The Equal Rights Amendment was being debated in state houses across the nation. The women's liberation movement was fundamentally reshaping American expectations about marriage, professional ambition, and domestic responsibility. The Stepford Wives gave a name to the backlash before the backlash had fully organized itself. Wool, the film was imperfect. The metaphor it introduced was not. Number 24, Hot Wheels. Mattel had introduced Hot Wheels die-cast cars in 1968, but by 1975, the cars and the distinctive orange plastic track had colonized the bedroom floors, basement carpets, and kitchen linoleum of American childhood with a thoroughness that no competing toy could approach. The cars were small, heavy, die-cast metal bodies with plastic interiors and low-friction axles that spun freely, and they were engineered to go fast on the flexible orange track sections that clicked together end-to-end and could be configured into loops, jumps, banked curves, and straightaways of escalating ambition. The track attached to walls, table edges, and doorknobs using plastic clamps, and a battery-powered booster module launched the cars through the course at velocities that occasionally sent them off the track and into the side of a younger sibling's head, which was always ruled an accident. The cars cost less than $1 each in 1975. Gonyabuanendand. The track sets were more expensive but appeared under the Christmas tree with reliable frequency. Every boy had a favorite car, argued for its superiority against all challengers, and eventually lost one of its wheels in the carpet where it was never recovered. Number 23. The Big Wheel. The Big Wheel was the first vehicle most American children ever operated under their own power, and in 1975, it ruled the driveways and sidewalks of suburban neighborhoods with the quiet authority of a machine that understood its audience completely. Manufactured by Mark's Toys, it sat low to the ground on 3 hollow plastic wheels, an oversized front wheel that the rider pedaled directly and 2 smaller trailing wheels in the back that followed wherever the front went. The seat was a molded plastic shell with no cushion and no adjustment. There were no brakes in any meaningful mechanical sense. Stopping required pulling the hand lever that locked the rear wheels against the pavement, producing a controlled skid that wore a flat spot into the rear tires within the first 2 weeks and generated a grinding sound that announced your approach from half a block away. The Big Wheel was marketed as virtually indestructible, but the plastic handlebars loosened, the seat developed cracks along the stress lines, and the tires wore down to smooth nubs over the course of a single determined summer. Nobody cared. A replacement cost around $7, and every child on the block owned one. Number 22. The Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme. In 1975, the Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme was the best-selling automobile in America, and the Rearview reason was not complicated or mysterious. It was a mid-size coupe with a V8, a quiet ride, and enough chrome to suggest its owner had arrived at a comfortable station without being showy about it. The Cutlass sat at the exact center of the market, larger than a Nova, smaller than a Cadillac, better looking than either. Oldsmobile moved over 300,000 units that year. The colonnade hardtop body style, with its formal squared-off roof pillars and small opera windows set into the C-pillar, was the visual shape of mainstream American automotive success in 1975. The Cutlass was not a muscle car and made no claim to be one. It was not an economy car and would have been offended by the comparison. It was the car you purchased when you had finished proving something and wanted a vehicle that simply did everything well without asking for attention. Number 21. Rhinestone Cowboy. Glenn Campbell released the single in June 1975, and the song spent 2 weeks at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and an even longer stretch at the top of the country chart. The lyrics told the story of a dreamer walking through a city that had not yet decided to reward him, and the chorus, with its image of riding through Broadway like a rhinestone cowboy, merged country storytelling with pop studio production in a way that opened both charts simultaneously and offended the purists on each. Campbell's voice was clean, warm, and entirely without the rough edges that Nashville traditionalists preferred. He had spent years as a session guitarist in Los Angeles before becoming a solo performer, playing on recordings for artists ranging from Frank Sinatra to the Beach Boys, and that professionalism carried over into his vocal delivery, precise, emotionally controlled, and capable of landing a sentimental line without tipping into excess. Rhinestone Cowboy became the defining hit of his career, and, for a particular audience, the sound of an American optimism that still believed the work would eventually be recognized. Number 20. Sea Monkeys. If you read comic books in 1975, and nearly every American child did at some point during the year, then you had seen the advertisement. It occupied a full page in the back of the book, between the X-ray glasses and the Charles Atlas bodybuilding course, and it depicted a family of smiling, crowned aquatic creatures living in what appeared to be an underwater kingdom, complete with a castle, a throne, and expressions of undeniable contentment. The ad promised that you too could own this miracle of instant life for just $1.25 plus postage and handling. What arrived several weeks later in a small brown envelope was a packet of dried brine shrimp eggs. You emptied the packet into a small plastic tank filled with treated water, waited approximately 48 hours, and a cloud of near-microscopic translucent organisms hatched and began drifting aimlessly around the container. They did not wear crowns. They bore no resemblance to the royal family in the advertisement. They were barely visible specks drifting through cloudy water, and yet millions of children ordered them year after year, sustained by the distance between promise and delivery, which was, in its own way, the most American product of all. Number 19. The Super 8 Home Movie Camera. In 1975, the Super 8 camera was the instrument through which most American families preserved the record of their own lives. Kodak had introduced the format a decade earlier, and by the mid-1970s, the cameras were compact enough to carry in one hand and affordable enough for a middle-class household to own without deliberation. The film came in a self-loading cartridge that clicked into the back of the camera body with a single motion. You aimed the lens, pressed the trigger, and the motor advanced the film while you recorded 3 minutes and 20 seconds of silent footage per cartridge. The exposed cartridge went to a processing lab by mail, and a few weeks later, the developed footage came back as a small reel that you threaded through a projector and watched on a pull-down screen or a blank white wall. The projector hummed. The image flickered. The colors were saturated in a way that digital video has never replicated. Every birthday, every barbecue, every Christmas morning existed as 3 minutes of silent film in a labeled cardboard box on a closet shelf. The footage was imperfect, often overexposed or poorly framed. It was also irreplaceable. Number 18. 3 Days of the Condor. Sidney Pollack's political thriller opened in September 1975, and Robert Redford played a low-level CIA analyst who leaves the office during his lunch hour, returns 45 minutes later, and finds every one of his co-workers shot dead at their desks. The film captured a national mood with startling accuracy. In the same year that the Church Committee was revealing documented evidence of illegal CIA surveillance, FBI domestic spying programs, and government-sanctioned assassination plots abroad. A movie about a man who discovers that his own intelligence agency is trying to kill him because he accidentally uncovered an unauthorized operation felt less like Hollywood fiction and more like a plausible Tuesday. Max von Sydow played the assassin with a calm that made killing feel administrative. The final scene, in which Redford delivers stolen files to the New York Times and asks a CIA superior how he can be sure the paper will print them, remains one of the most chilling endings of the decade. In 1975, that question was not rhetorical. Number 17. M*A*S*H. By 1975, M*A*S*H was deep into its run on CBS and had already begun its transformation from a well-regarded service comedy into one of the most significant programs in the history of American television. Set during the Korean War, but aimed with unmistakable precision at a nation still processing Vietnam, the show followed the surgeons, nurses, and enlisted personnel of the 4077th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital as they operated on an endless stream of wounded soldiers, brewed illegal gin in the officers' tent they called the Swamp, and fought to maintain their sanity and their humanity in the middle of a war that none of them had volunteered to join. Alan Alda played Captain Benjamin Franklin Pierce, known as Hawkeye, with a layered combination of surgical brilliance, relentless wisecracking, and barely suppressed anguish that gave the show its emotional center of gravity. The writing staff balanced comedy and genuine tragedy within individual episodes in a way that no American situation comedy had seriously attempted before. A scene could move from a joke about the quality of mess hall food to a surgeon losing a 19-year-old patient on the operating table in less than 90 seconds, and neither moment rang false. The laugh track, which CBS network executives had insisted upon over the strenuous objections of the show's producers, was notably absent during the surgical scenes, and the silence in those operating room moments carried more emotional weight than any sound effect or musical cue. What made M*A*S*H remarkable in 1975 was its flat refusal to treat war as anything other than a catastrophe being managed by ordinary people who happened to be intelligent and happened to be funny. The show did not glorify military service. It did not reduce the enemy to convenient caricature. It did not wrap up its moral questions in a neat resolution before the final commercial break. The series finale, broadcast in February 1983, drew over 105 million viewers, the largest single audience for scripted television in American history. But in 1975, M*A*S*H was still finding its full cast and creative team, still proving every week that a comedy set in a war zone could be the most truthful program on American television. Number 16. Shrinky Dinks. Shrinky Dinks arrived in American toy stores in 1973 and by 1975 had become one of those craft activities that occupied every rainy Saturday afternoon in households with school-age children. The concept was satisfying in its simplicity and mesmerizing in its execution. You colored a pre-printed design on a sheet of thin polystyrene plastic using crayons or colored pencils, cut it out with household scissors, placed it on a foil-lined baking sheet, and slid it into a kitchen oven preheated to 325 degrees. Resetted degrees then to an inch, the plastic curled, twisted, and contracted dramatically, shrinking to roughly 1/3 of its original dimensions while thickening proportionally into a rigid miniature version of the original drawing. The colors intensified during the process, the details sharpened. The transformation was genuinely riveting to watch through the oven door window, and the results were durable enough to become keychains, Christmas ornaments, and refrigerator magnets that lasted for years. Every Shrinky Dinks kit gave a child access to a manufacturing process that felt indistinguishable from magic and cost under $3 at the store. Number 15. The Hi-Fi Stereo Component System. By 1975, the home stereo component system had established itself as the centerpiece of the American living room, rivaling the television set in importance and, in a certain kind of household, surpassing it entirely. The typical setup consisted of a receiver with a brushed aluminum faceplate and a row of backlit tuning indicators, a belt-driven turntable with a hinged dust cover, a cassette deck for recording and playback, and a pair of floor-standing speakers positioned on opposite sides of the room, connected to the receiver by a tangle of speaker wire concealed behind a shelving unit of teak or walnut veneer. The receiver's tuning dial glowed amber or warm green when powered on, and sweeping the needle across the FM band with the tuning knob had a tactile precision that made finding a station feel like a small act of discovery. The turntable was the heart of the system. You slid the record from its sleeve, placed it on the platter, and lowered the stylus. Fluid decoration raised on single-speaker radios. Stereo was a revelation. The speakers were large because the sound deserved to be large, and in 1975, nobody apologized for the space they took up. Number 14. The ice cream truck. The ice cream truck arrived on a schedule that no calendar posted, but every child on the block had memorized within the first week of summer. The jingle began as a distant, tinny melody somewhere around the far corner, recognizable from a quarter-mile away, and by the time the white truck rounded the curve onto your street, every kid in the neighborhood was already sprinting toward the curb, clutching whatever coins they had found between the sofa cushions or borrowed from the kitchen counter without formal authorization. The side panel displayed a laminated menu: bomb pop, drumstick, fudsicle, creamsicle, and the premium item at the top that cost more than any allowance could justify. You pointed, paid, and ate it on the sidewalk while it melted faster than you could keep up. The truck moved on. The jingle faded. Summer resumed. Number 13. The Light Bright. The Light Bright was a black plastic box with a light bulb inside and a grid of small perforations on the front panel, and it was one of the most quietly absorbing toys in any American household in 1975. Hasbro had introduced it in 1967, and the design had not changed in the intervening 8 years. You placed a sheet of black construction paper over the perforated screen, selected a small colored translucent peg from the divided tray, pushed it through one of the holes in the paper, and the backlight illuminated the peg from behind, producing a single glowing point of color against the dark background. Templates suggested clowns, ships, flowers, but the real satisfaction was abandoning the templates and placing pegs freehand, watching a glowing image emerge one dot at a time in a dark room. The hazard was stepping on a stray peg afterward. They were small, pointed, and spread across the carpet with quiet hostility. Every set came with hundreds. Within a month, there were never enough. Number 12. Inflation and the price of everything. In 1975, the price of everything was climbing, and nobody could agree on how to make it stop. The Consumer Price Index rose over 9% that year. A gallon of whole milk cost $1.57. A loaf of white bread reached 36 cents. A dozen large eggs went for 84 cents. A pound of ground beef touched 89 cents. These numbers sound modest now, but they represented increases of 20 to 30% over prices just 3 years earlier, and wages had not kept pace. Shopping became weekly arithmetic. Coupons were clipped with the focus of a securities analyst. The recession of 1974 to 75, the deepest economic contraction since the 1930s, had pushed unemployment past 9%. The nation was experiencing a condition that economists called stagflation, rising consumer prices and rising joblessness occurring simultaneously, a combination that the standard economic textbooks had declared theoretically impossible. The textbooks turned out to be wrong, and the grocery receipt proved it every single week. Number 11. The gas station self-service pump. In 1975, a new arrangement was appearing at gasoline stations across the country, the self-service island. For as long as most American drivers could remember, pulling into a gas station meant being greeted by an attendant in a branded uniform who pumped your fuel, checked your oil level, inspected your fan belt, cleaned your windshield with a squeegee, and verified the air pressure in all 4 tires. That full-service model was dying. The energy crisis of 1973 to 74 had compressed profit margins to the point where many independent station owners could no longer afford to keep an attendant at every pump. Self-service islands offered a discount of several cents per gallon to drivers willing to do it themselves. Not everyone embraced the change. Several states, including New Jersey and Oregon, passed laws requiring full-service pumping, and New Jersey kept that law for decades. In most of the country, however, the uniformed attendant with the oil rag tucked into his back pocket was already fading into memory. The last gallon he would pump for you was on its way into the tank. Number 10. The television antenna rotator. Mounted to the wall in the hallway or next to the television set, the antenna rotator control was a small beige or brown box with a circular dial marked in compass directions, and turning that dial sent the outdoor antenna on the roof slowly swinging on its mast until it pointed toward the broadcast tower of the station you wanted to receive. The motor mounted at the base of the antenna produced a low mechanical hum that was audible inside the house. The antenna pivoted. The picture on the screen dissolved briefly into static, then gradually sharpened and stabilized as the signal locked in. The rotation took 30 seconds, during which the family watched the screen with surgical intensity. A clear picture on Channel 13 sometimes meant losing Channel 5 entirely, which required a negotiation about programming priorities that tested the household's democratic principles. The antenna rotator was not sophisticated technology by any standard. It was the technology that made broadcast television watchable for every family living more than 30 miles from a transmitter, which in 1975 was most of America. Number 9. Wacky packages. Topps, the company best known for baseball cards, also produced Wacky Packages sticker trading cards, and by 1975, every child in America with access to a candy counter was collecting them, trading them at recess and applying them to notebooks, school lockers, bedroom doors, and any available surface that would accept an adhesive backing. The concept was parody, applied with surprising precision to the most recognizable consumer products on the grocery store shelf. Crest toothpaste became Crust. Band-Aid became Bland-Aid. Tide detergent became Tide. Ritz crackers became Rats. The artwork was painted by professional illustrators from the underground comics scene, and the visual satire was considerably sharper than most parents who glanced at the stickers realized. Children who could not have named a sitting senator could identify every branded product on the supermarket shelf from memory, largely because they had memorized the Wacky Packages parody version first. The stickers came in foil wax packs with a flat rectangle of stale pink bubblegum that nobody chewed voluntarily, and trading duplicates during the school lunch period operated on a barter economy of considerable sophistication. Number 8. The Viewmaster. The Viewmaster had been in continuous production since 1939, but in 1975 it remained one of the most universally owned toys in the American household, present in living rooms, children's bedrooms, and pediatric waiting rooms with a frequency that suggested permanence. The device was a binocular-style viewer molded from red or orange plastic, and it operated on a principle so simple it barely required explanation. You inserted a thin cardboard disc containing 14 tiny Kodachrome transparencies arranged in 7 stereoscopic pairs around the perimeter, held the viewer up to any source of light, and pressed the lever on the right side. The disc advanced 1 click. A 3-dimensional image appeared in the twin eyepieces with a depth and color saturation so vivid that it made the actual room around you seem slightly inadequate by comparison. The reels covered everything: national parks, Disneyland, cartoon characters, world landmarks. There was something about the Viewmaster that no flat photograph has ever replicated. The depth was real. The colors were impossibly vivid. For a few seconds with each click, you were somewhere else entirely. Number 7. The Spirograph. The Spirograph was a set of interlocking plastic gears and rings that produced geometric patterns of almost mathematical beauty. And in 1975, it was the art supply that briefly convinced every child who used it that a career in design was a realistic ambition. Kenner had been manufacturing the toy since 1966, based on a concept invented by a British mechanical engineer named Dennis Fisher. You pinned a ring to paper, placed a smaller gear inside it, inserted a pen and traced. The gear rotated, and a spiraling geometric pattern appeared on the page. The patterns were mesmerizing. Changing the whole changed the design. Layering colors produced results that looked professional enough to frame, and many were. The only hazard was the pins, which went through the paper, the table, and occasionally a finger. Number 6. Robert Altman's Nashville. The film opened in June 1975 with a cast of 24 principal characters, a running time exceeding 2.5 hours, and a creative ambition so expansive that critics at the time could not reach consensus on whether they had just witnessed a masterpiece or a self-indulgent sprawl. It was both. Altman set the film across 5 days in the country music capital of Tennessee and wove together an ensemble of musicians, political operatives, aspiring singers, journalists, groupies, veterans, and ordinary people into a tapestry that captured more truth about America in 1975 than any film that directly claimed to be about the state of the nation. The dialogue was largely improvised. The songs were written and performed by the cast. The overlapping conversations, captured on a multi-track system Altman built for the production, sounded like real life overheard. The film ended with an assassination at a rally and a crowd singing "It Don't Worry Me" as if violence were just another verse. Nashville remains one of the most ambitious and least classifiable American films ever produced. Number 5. The Telephone Answering Machine. The residential answering machine existed in 1975, but it had not yet become common. The PhoneMate Model 400, one of the first consumer units marketed to American households, had been introduced in 1971, and by the middle of the decade, a growing number of homes and small businesses had adopted one. The device was roughly the size of a shoebox and sat next to the telephone on a table or desk. It used 2 standard cassette tapes, a short one for the outgoing greeting that callers heard, and a longer one for recording the incoming messages they left. Getting the outgoing message right could occupy an entire afternoon of recording and re-recording. Retrieving messages meant pressing a button and waiting for the tape to rewind before the calls played back in order. The answering machine changed a basic contract of American life. Longer had to be home to know who had called. In 1975, that shift felt significant. Number 4. The Brown Paper Grocery Bag. In 1975, every trip to the supermarket ended the same way. A teenager or a stock clerk standing at the end of the checkout lane packed your purchases into large brown paper bags, placing the heavy items on the bottom and the eggs and bread on top, and asked paper or plastic to exactly nobody because there was no plastic option. The paper bag was the only container available, and it was the only one anyone expected. It was brown, thick-walled, flat-bottomed, and structured well enough to stand upright on the kitchen counter while you unloaded it. A single bag could accommodate a gallon of milk, a loaf of bread, 2 cans of soup, and a box of cereal without complaint or collapse. The bags had second careers as textbook covers, leaf containers, and Halloween masks with eye holes. The bottom gave out occasionally in the driveway, scattering cans across the Wamani-Peens. They'd van the OEB-Bienduf. Namsha Lothing Christekins this the deck. Asphalt. It was a known risk. Nobody sued the bag. Number 3. The 10-cent postage stamp. On December 31, 1975, a first-class postage stamp in the United States cost 10 cents. It had been raised from 8 cents in March of 1974, and it would climb to 13 cents the following December. But in 1975, a single thin dime was all that was required to send a letter from one end of the country to the other. You wrote a letter, folded it into an envelope, licked the stamp, and dropped it in the nearest blue mailbox. It arrived in 2 to 4 days. A birthday card to your grandmother in Oregon cost a dime. A love letter cost a dime. A college application cost a dime. Every emotion too important for a phone call and too permanent for spoken conversation traveled through the United States Postal Service for the price of a piece of penny candy. Number 2. The family dinner at 6 o'clock. In 1975, dinner happened at approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, and the entire family sat down at the same table to eat it together. This was not an aspiration promoted by a magazine article. It was not a lifestyle trend or a parenting philosophy. It was simply what happened in the majority of American households every weeknight of the year. The food was on the table. The television was turned off, or at least it was supposed to be. Every family member had an assigned seat, and the seat did not change from one evening to the next. The conversation covered the school day, the work day, what the neighbors had done, and whatever Walter Cronkite had reported at 5:30 in roughly that order. Nobody looked at a phone because there was nothing on a phone to look at. Nobody left the table early because there was nowhere better to be. The family dinner in 1975 was not remarkable to the people who ate it. It was ordinary, sometimes boring, occasionally tense. Nobody knew it was disappearing. In 1975, dinner at 6 was just dinner at 6. That was exactly what made it irreplaceable. Number 1. The year between the storm and the celebration. 1975 sat between two of the loudest moments in 20th century American life. Behind it was Watergate, the fall of Saigon, the oil embargo, a national recession, and a president who had resigned from office in disgrace. Ahead of it was the bicentennial celebration, a presidential election that would bring a peanut farmer from Georgia to the White House, and a country trying hard to remember what collective optimism sounded like. In between those two poles, 1975 was the quiet year, the year the music played while the nation caught its breath. Jaws filled the movie theaters, Springsteen filled the clubs, The Hustle filled the dance floors, the Sears catalog arrived in the mailbox. The crock pot simmered all afternoon on the kitchen counter. The television station signed off at midnight with the national anthem, and the house went silent, and the children slept in rooms lit only by the green glow of a flip clock turning over one soft click at a time through the longest and most ordinary hours of a year that did not yet know it was making history. That was 1975. If you lived through it, you already know what it felt like. And if you did not, now you have some idea of what you missed. And that is 1975. 100 pieces of a year that shaped the country in ways large and small, from the halls of Congress to the kitchen counter, from the movie theater to the bedroom nightstand with the flip clock ticking away the minutes. If any of these brought back a memory you had not thought about in years, drop it in the comments. Nyumpi, which one hit closest to home for you? If you made it this far, you are the reason this channel exists, and that means something. Hit the subscribe button if you have not already, and turn on the bell so you never miss another trip back in time. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Until next time, take care of each other.